привет. Меня зовут Алексей.
Hi all, my name is Alexey. I work at Innostage, deputy CTO. That's my boss here.
Так, сегодня расскажу про
And today I'll be speaking about
чего он нужен, собственно,
what an
что такое
architect
архитектура, как
is,
она
why
используется
we
в
need
реальной
them,
жизни. И
how
здесь русская
architectures
модель архитектора, я думаю,
get
там
used in real life.
99% я, наверное,
Some architects
надавлю на больное и
raised
покажу,
their
как
hands.
уже
We
все-таки
have
на
some in the
этом
room today,
небосклоне
so
зародился
I'll be
бывший
pressing your buttons
архитектор
today.
в постоянно меняющемся мире.
How can an
Через
architect
методологию,
survive
да.
in this ever-changing
Прежде
world
того,
with
хотел
the help
бы,
of
чтобы
methodology?
каждый здесь, наверное, в зале
Instead of a
надел на
foreword,
себя шапочку архитектора,
I will
да,
just ask
и
you to put on your architect's hat
представил, да, что к нему пришли,
and imagine that
попросили сделать какое-то чудо,
business comes to you
спроектировать
and
будущее,
asks for a miracle.
внедрить какую-то систему,
Envisage a
спроектировать, да.
future
И, как
with a
правило,
great new
главных
system.
заказчиков или тот, кто ставит эту задачу, вот рисуются
The
какие-то
customers
замки
or the business
волшебные,
usually
и
imagine
архитектор
some
должен с
magical
этим
castles in the
разобраться.
air,
Но
and the
когда
architect
архитектор начинает
needs to ground them.
прикладываться, так сказать, к
And
задаче,
once you start
он понимает,
doing
что
this,
что-то
as an
происходило
architect,
до того, как эта задача
you
родилась. И по
realize
факту
that
он
there is some background
начинает свою деятельность с того, что он
to
видит
this
какой-то
task
туман
that was
войны,
given to you.
какие-то
So
замки, но не
it's
те.
like the fog
А
of
надо, чтобы
war,
те, которые
and
хочет
you are
заказчик.
not seeing
И
what
все, что
the
происходило до, это
customer
то, что
actually
на
wants.
данный момент есть у архитектора. Да? Другого нет.
And you have what you have,
Миссия архитектора, да, я вот
which leads us to the architect's mission.
он должен избежать
That's a
какой-то
big word,
дичи,
but
да, на выходе.
an architect is
Продукт
there
деятельности
to
архитектора. И он
prevent
должен
any
как раз-таки
spectacular
разобраться, что
failure
же
as an
хочет
outcome.
заказчик на самом деле. Он
An
должен
architect
понять,
needs
какое,
to
если даже что-то происходило,
actually make
проект
sense
свернул не
of what
туда,
the
и
customer
как это
wants,
все вырулить
what
на
they
рельсы
really
так,
want.
чтобы заказчик
If there
получил
was a
именно то,
misstep
что
in the
надо.
project, the
Надо
architect is
получить.
there to correct it so that the customer
Перед
gets
тем,
what
как
they
я
need.
перейду к каким-то сложным схемам, хочется
Before I
выразиться
go
про
to
онтологическую
sophisticated
картину
charts,
архитектора. Да? То есть это такое
let's
представление
align
мира, в котором
on
да, живет
the
каждый
architect's
проектирующий
worldview.
архитектор.
I
Да,
think any
во-первых,
designer or
архитектор,
architect
представим, это система,
operates
в
in
которой
these
есть элементы и
domains.
как-то между
An
собой
architecture
они
is a system, there are
связаны.
elements and they are all interrelated.
Структуры компонентов, взаимосвязи,
Structures of
все это
components, their
формализовано в
interlinkages,
виде такого
it's all
объекта, как
formalized
архитектура.
as an architecture.
Смысл
That's
архитектуры
our
вообще,
entity.
зачем она нужна, да, это
The
повышение
reason
эффективности
for there
проводимых
being an
изменений.
architecture is
Да, я здесь
to
процитирую свой слайд.
increase efficiency of changes made
Этот
to
же
it.
смысл накладывается на то, что
And
в архитектура должна
this
отражать
means, by
текущее
extension,
состояние
that the architecture
и
needs to
то, что
reflect
Б,
the
да, целевое
as-is
состояние,
state and the to-be state. So it needs to take you from A to B
привести.
through
И, собственно,
change.
про изменения, да, про ключевой
And then you have
свойство,
actual
наверное,
change, the third
архитектуры.
pillar in the slide,
Как
which
раз-таки
is the
показать
key
переход от состояния
quality
А
or
в состояние
parameter of
Б, потому что
architecture.
компоненты какие-то могут
Be able
меняться,
to
изменяться.
show
И вот как вот с этим
the
всем
as-is and the
бороться,
to-be,
как
because
раз-таки
components are
я
always changing
расскажу
and
через то,
it's a
что
tough soup to
методику
survive in.
архитектурного дизайна и фиксация потребностей.
I'll be covering it through
Сложный
the
слайд,
methodology of
да,
architecture
но
design and
он
collection
о
of
чем?
needs.
Это
It's a
основные
crowded
факторы,
slide, but
которые
these are the
позволяют
main
архитектору сойти с ума,
attributes
наверное, да, и
that
не держать в
allow
голове
us
очень
all
много
architects
информации,
to keep
когда,
our
как Антон
sanity
сказал,
and not
пришли в пятницу и
to
сказали «надо», да, и
have
все
to get
начинают
bogged down
что-то
in
делать, а когда есть
details,
определенный фреймворк,
like a Friday
да, с
deploy
английского
that
фреймворк это переводится
Anton
как
mentioned.
рамки работы, наверное, да, это тот
When you
путь,
have a
который надо
framework,
пройти, однозначно
something that
получить результат.
defines
Вот как раз-таки про
the
эту сложную
space
схему
you
взаимодействия я и
operated,
расскажу, но я
it
не буду
helps
рассказывать
you
все виды
to go
взаимодействия.
through the
Я
design
расскажу
process. I'm not
основные
going to
артефакты,
cover all
на
the
которые можно перекладывать
interactions, but
свои
I'll be speaking
мысли
about the main
архитектору для
attributes
того, чтобы
that
спроектировать идеальную
you
картину
can
для
use to
заказчика.
articulate your thoughts as you're considering this
Но перед
ideal
этим,
to-be
да,
state
собственно,
for the
еще раз сделаю
customer.
такой остановочный слайд про то, что люди
Before that, though,
несовершенные существа. Можете
I'll mention once again that we're all human. Humans are
человечество ничего
imperfect,
умнее не придумало на данный момент,
and
как
we still haven't come up
письменность,
with anything
да, и
better
какие-то
than
картинки, да, рисовать.
written
Да,
language
по
and
факту,
pictures.
как мы можем перенести свои мысли и свои идеи
That's what we have
нашему
to
оппоненту,
convey
там, будь то это
our thoughts
заказчик,
and
будь то это
ideas
проектная
to
команда, да,
anybody in front of
всегда
us, the
люди
customer,
называют
the project
обманываться
team.
словами. Да? И
We
вот
need
как раз-таки
to
методология архитектурного
speak
дизайна,
in
она про то,
words
что
to come to an
давайте
agreement. So the methodology of architectural design seeks to give us a common language. This morning, in one of the conversations, we mentioned that medical professionals sometimes use Latin words to understand each other better. It's a good example of standardized communication. So this means that point A to the left, where we have this state with a mixed bag of relations in different categories marked by triangles and circles. We need to bring it under an umbrella of a single system. The natural thing to do would be just trying one option after the other, trial and error. But we don't have years and years to try and implement something to the customer. And then we have the world, which is constantly changing, and we need to be able to adapt. So using these attributes to communicate help us, well, no other way to put it than help us communicate more effectively and efficiently. Here is the RCTM, the matrix. Some of you might be aware of it. Even the most advanced framework would rely on requirements. An architect needs to know what's needed, what's not needed. This matrix allows you to record what you need to put in and what you need to exclude from your recipe of the ideal to-be state. This requirements catalog is more about content. I'm not imposing this form on you. This can be a registry, this can be an Excel file. So somewhere there you write down all the requirements you've received from the customer, from the regulator, or whatever else. The next attribute is what we call the RAID log, which stands for risks, assumptions, issues, and dependencies. Another tool to record the real world and your situation as you are designing your to-be state. Again, these are well-known things, but as an architect, as you do design, as you develop documentation, you need to show how you mitigate risks, and you need to eliminate as many assumptions as possible. A RAID log might be an Excel with a number of sheets. It's a straightforward tool. Again, exporting your thoughts and ideas as an architect or a group of architects into a document, because you can't keep it all in your mind's eye if you design large systems. My emotional take on this is that you wouldn't survive without it. Then you have KSVI, the solution volume indices and information. That's your boundaries. These are quantified metrics. These are not qualitative. This records your current state, some idea of the to-be state in pieces or in units, because you need to account for sizing, adaptation, expansion, scaling. This is the tool for you to record all this and see what scope the architecture is designed for. Imagine if you design something and then you get asked about this size a year after. Try finding that in your email. Why covering this ground? This leads us to AOD, because we've been doing a lot of paperwork in the previous slides, right? Why do we need that? This is for us to have an architecture overview document. A definitive document which clearly states what the customer is going to get. We need to be unambiguous here. And An AOD with letters that come into words, strings and sentences and pictures is the answer. There's a number of chapters or sections. Some can be omitted, it's pretty flexible. But the main thing is that all the attributes that we use to design the solution are shown in the document or referred to. Not going to read from the slide. That's the minimum sufficient set of elements that can describe an architecture solution. You can do this in your internal projects as well, or projects with the customer too. This is another tool, basically. If you are uncertain or cannot know how the final solution will look, this is a document that can help your customer or requester have a discussion of the to-be state. And this is done iteratively. I'm not claiming that if you fill out some document once, you then get something that's set in stone. It's a lot of hard work, but it gives you a lot of clarity. Again, you can't put it all in your mind, you can't keep it in your mind. And through iteration, you make a push to finalize some solution.
Итеративный дизайн — наше все. Да, здесь
It's all about iterative design. It's a well-known picture.
JPEG от Артемия Лебедева, да?
Aggressive JPEG downloads from Artemy Lebedev.
Нету всей информации, которая ему поможет.
The architect never has all the information for them to properly design what's needed. But they need to have a threshold for sufficient information to enable them to design some to-be vision.
По сути, проектированием.
I think it's pretty, as an analogy in the slide. You see a blue trash bin. This is what the customer wanted. It lists by all of its physical parameters, but then it turns out that they wanted a sort of a bathtub in a barrel for their kid. This happens, and my speech today is all about getting it right, so that you don't waste time with such mistakes. The value chain has to get shorter, so losing time on coordination and approvals were what Anton mentioned. Not losing this time should be a major advantage. And if you learn to communicate more efficiently, to understand each other better, to get it right, this is going to be your key to success. Here is to preempt some of your questions. For the customer's question, it's all based on TOGAFI, Lean, bunch of practical experience. Highly recommended to design of complex systems, especially by groups of people. Of course, it's not silver bullet, so sometimes it doesn't work. But I'm still hopeful that I have been able to structure your idea of the architect's workflow. Thank you.
Лёш, спасибо большое.
Thank you, Alexey.
А сейчас вот
Thanks a lot.
я почитаю докладчикам ваши вопросы и попрошу их...
So I'll be asking your questions to the panelists
Некоторые вопросы
now.
я сразу пропущу, поэтому не
I'll
ожидайте,
skip
что
some.
все вопросы
So
будут
if you've
прохождены.
submitted something,
Вопрос
don't
первый, и это вопрос
count on it to be
Айдару, он возник после его
asked
выступления.
necessarily.
В
A question to
качестве
Aidar,
приведена
following on his
типизация
speech.
доступов для администраторов. Почему
As a pattern, there is standardization of access for admins. Why typization or standardization of non-privileged users or external users like contractors is not a good architecture solution? Well, I was all for typization or standardization. It's about not inventing the be-all, so to speak, for access for each new contractor. Reuse what you have. If you have a jump farm deployed for access or a PAM system that you have internally, You reuse it externally. My message was to reuse as many things as possible. Okay, thank you. An interesting question. It's not round table, but here is a free-for-all. Automating architecture. What are the most prominent examples of automation and development metrics in this area?
У меня всегда была мечта как-то заавтоматизировать.
I've had this dream to automate design. Haven't succeeded yet.
Так, ребят, еще одна, Леш.
Да, на
Окей,
самом
Алексей.
деле есть системы управления enterprise архитектурой.
There are enterprise architecture management systems, specialized software that's based on TOGAFI.
управления архитектурой предприятия.
These are
То, что
specialized
я рассказывал, это
ERP-like systems.
элементы вот этих систем. И
And I've been covering some elements from these systems. It's a whole subset of solutions, class of solutions, but it is only suitable for very, very large, complex systems. I don't mean an IT system. I mean an architecture of an entire enterprise. Maybe it's a separate presentation. These cost several million rubles. Yes, it's cognitive hardcore, it's expensive, but it is out there. You can look it up on Google. Enterprise level architecture management. It has been invented. A question to Vyacheslav. I appreciate this question a lot. I'm sure it's about one of your slides. Don't you think that we have a bias against fines, like a motoring offender would be upset not about the fine, but about getting caught? Isn't there a similar attitude in information security? True that. And some companies, some players have been taking the typical Russian attitude of trying to hope for the best. It's a risk, but it might not materialize. So, to counter that, let's say fair attitude, there is a separate penalty for not reporting a leak. So you'll get fined for your leak, and then on top of that, they'll get you on failing to report it. It has been relatively slow, but over the past 3 years, the market has been coming to this realization that the initial fine is half the story. It's a whole iceberg, because the fallout for you is much more severe, and the potential losses there are much more severe. People starting to realize that. They've learned some arithmetics and have been changing. Yeah, this made me think of a story like some country like Kazakhstan. They have a penalty for not reporting a leak within the first 24 hours. Company adopted it, or are they still developing? That it's required for any organization to spend at least 10% of their IT budget on security. Just imagine that. Now, question to Vyacheslav and Maria. I'll read 2 technical questions. You can take it offline if you like, but I think they are interesting. What are the main principles for developing databases in order to prevent excessive richness of data and to ensure a high level of security? And then, adhering to naming conventions in designing databases improves security but makes development harder. What's more important? And are there examples of automating proper development of databases? You can take it offline after the track, but I just wanted to read this one. Yeah, another question that merits a whole separate track in itself. It's always a trade-off between information security, labor intensity of development, loads, and some other things, I guess.
До этого на качественном уровне не дошла.
Automation hasn't advanced as far in terms of quality to enable this.
Скажем так, причесывать базы данных.
We're looking into it, and there are some solutions that aim to
передать потом базы в тест.
clean up databases, do some minor processing, and we see it in anonymization, because incoming databases are a pain. They're pain for the users. Data can be unstructured, unprocessable, basically. So people who deal with it, they don't know how to start in cleaning up the mess that you have, let alone automating it. These are very good questions, and we can dedicate a whole track to it next year. Here's an example. How many ways there are to enter day, date, and year in a database? How many ways to do this? You don't have enough fingers on your hand. How many formats? What's the order of magnitude or the number of formats? Let me say a couple of dozens and you'll prove me wrong. Well, I'm not going to attack you for this, but it's just within one organization, for example, where you ask, how did this happen? They always say the same thing. What do you think it is?
Исторически сложилось.
Вот, так исторически сложилось, да, как бы этот мой любимый вопрос, как бы, потому что я его уже раза два задавал.
It has grown to be so historically. Yes, people know about this.
Как бы, когда вы начнете с этим сталкиваться,
Just turned out like this. And when you face this, when you start thinking about some standardization, when you'll see how bad it is. A whole separate subject, I think, can have a separate discussion. Okay, thank you. Well, I think we have taken some slots now in the next year's PhD's program. And there were a lot of questions about pilots, a very controversial subject. Functionality, in or out. These are important questions, but I'll omit most of them because they're specific, and I'll ask some questions that have a potential for discussion. I'll read it as this. You say that the integrator knows what to do. But who will teach the integrator what to do? Let's say there is a new solution on the market. The customer needs it, but they don't know how to approach it. The vendor has developed it, but they only have a low-level understanding and they don't know how to implement. The integrator just wants to get paid, or being the nice guy. The vendor needs to know how it's implemented, teach the integrator, but then they need to speak to the customer. Why do we need the integrator? There are similar questions like that. I'd like Andrei and someone from Innostage to take this one.
Ну, смотрите, интегратор на самом деле не всегда нужен.
You don't always need an integrator, even if it's most of the cases.
В этой схеме может понадобиться? Во-первых, вендор должен все равно обучить интегратора.
What's the reason? You still need a vendor to teach the integrator, yes. The integrator has the resources, that's the point. They have engineers who can learn basically anything. That's what makes you an engineer. I used to set up Checkpoint, but then I got assigned to a project where I needed to learn Palo Alto. And I look at it and kind of think, this is all the same. If there is an engineer with a vendor who knows a class of products, they'll be able to learn their ropes without training in the new solution. Training is always good if it's available. The customers don't have the time, the vendor doesn't have the resources to do implementation on their own, even if unless it is a major vendor that has a dedicated business line that does that. So that's the competency of the integrator. If they want to get paid for just being nice, they don't have the engineers, that's not a proper integrator.
Вендоров много,
Let me add to
продуктов
this.
много.
Sometimes there are many vendors, many
Интегратор,
products,
несколько вендоров,
and
несколько продуктов в рамках одной компании внедряет. И внедрив
the
один продукт,
integrator is there to
интегратор
implement
уже
them
знает
all for one
нюансы
customer.
инфраструктуры, нюансы людей,
Having
и
done
ему
one
будет
of the
быстрее и
products,
проще. Конечно,
they already
учитывая, что
are
я
in the
этого
know
интегратора
on
обучил,
what the company
интегратору
is,
будет
where it
проще
gets implemented, what the
взаимодействовать с
architecture
заказчиком,
is,
поскольку
and
он
it's going to be
уже
easier
заказчики как рыба в воде.
to set up
Это
interaction
очень
with the
важный
customer.
фактор.
Я тебя здесь дополню.
They've broken in, they know each
Если
other.
обратиться
That's
к моим
good.
слайдам, как раз-таки опыт даже
Referring back to my
работы внедрений
slides,
у интегратора,
yes,
если это все превращать в
if there
понятные
are
артефакты,
one or two successful cases of integration
способность воспроизведения
recorded as
результата, передачу
artifacts,
знаний.
then you can set up transfer of knowledge and the integrator can do this replicable. For example, onboarding of new engineers for a project
Фаст-трека такого прокачки инженеров
can be fast-tracked through reuse of that experience,
условно.
so that
Могу
engineers
добавить, как представитель вендора, у которого есть
become
количество
useful quicker.
интеграторов. А
As a vendor who works a number of integrators,
он существует в
no
какой-то
product
среде, да, в рамках
exists in a vacuum.
Как правило,
There
у
is
интегратора,
always
у хорошего интегратора
some
есть опыт именно
environment,
в этой среде.
and
То есть
the
знание
integrator
этой
would
среды, и тем
have
самым он дополнительно
the
обогащает
experience of working in that environment.
какие есть
So
нюансы в практике. Вот, то есть
this
не
is
только
a
вначале
fruitful
вендор обучает
exchange
своему новому
between the
продукту
vendors and
интегратора,
the
безусловно,
integrators.
но
The
интегратор
vendors
может дать
deliver the
обратную
training,
связь
but
того,
then
какой
they can be
серьезный инструмент
feedback
этот вендор.
by the integrator
Это
as
очень
for
важная обратная
where
связь.
the vendor is going to have its solution implemented.
Ты добавишь, Антон? Он только коротко.
Would you like to build on that, Anton? But please be concise, okay?
Интегратор — это все-таки в первую очередь
An integrator is
решение проблем
first
дефицита
and
кадров.
foremost a way of addressing your talent shortage issues.
Однозначно.
Can you do an implementation on your own? Absolutely. Who knows your infrastructure best? Obviously, your own operators, your own people. At the same time, an integrator will have the acumen, will have more experience, and at the same time, they have a lot of project management experience across various industries. Now, this is a moot point, I guess. If, say, an integrator has been working with clients for a long time and they are not really visiting further, like weekend sort of further, they should be able to help you preserve your competences. Well, because what happens sometimes is that, there is some talent stealing happening. Okay, thank you so much, dear colleagues. Unfortunately, I don't have the time to read out all the questions, but naturally, once the speakers descend from the stage, you'll have an opportunity to catch them and torture them with your questions. But some questions I will ask. Alexey, question goes to you about artifacts. Are you using any specialized software to run your design projects? Nope, we are using Word and Excel as the classical tools.
Фреймворк переводится как каркас.
You know what? There is a Russian word for framework.
Значит,
Absolutely.
смотрите, тоже и еще два вопроса мне очень понравились. Компания вложила условный миллиард в ИБ.
Let's imagine a company that has invested 1 billion rubles in InfoSec. They've implemented everything they could, and then the company gets hacked and its systems get encrypted. Are there any guarantees that can be triggered this way? Will integrators ever, offer to be sort of held liable for a non-tolerable event happening to their clients? At the moment, nobody does that. There is no practice like this.
О чем сейчас вообще идет разговор, наверное, рынок, это о том, чтобы в ТЗ
What the market is currently discussing is whether we can include in the specs,
проекты, да, там большие.
particularly if we're talking about some major projects. So what they are talking about is having specs
какой-то архитектуры
where
доводить до состояния.
as architecture gets developed, it is taken by the contractor to the state where it can pass an independent audit. So if it's hacked during independent audit, well, there could be financial repercussions. But to my knowledge, not a single project like this has been implemented yet. Moreover, there are no regulatory requirements of this kind, so I'm not even sure it's going to happen anytime soon. Let me add here that what's being very much discussed right now is this idea of developing a ranking of cybersecurity or cyber resilience of companies, and based on that, well, effectively identifying the right value to attach to the so-called residual risks, because naturally the financial element here is very important. Now that's what we call results-driven cybersecurity. There was another question I really loved, and it went like this.
Заинтересовать руководство, по-моему, он так звучал.
Now, how can architects get the attention and the interest of the bosses?
Значит, как архитектору заинтересовать руководство в компании в необходимости архитектурного подхода?
In particular, how do they get the bosses interested in having the right attitude to architecture?
Попробую ответить. Здесь, наверное, ответ тоже был в моих слайдах про то, что архитектура нужна для того, чтобы...
Is something you can find in my slides. So we need the right kind of architecture to introduce changes in it quickly and efficiently. So if you want all the changes you introduce to be efficient and effective,
И с точки зрения инвестиций, да, то, наверное, ответ архитектура нужна.
then you do need the right kind of architecture.
Спасибо. Спасибо, коллеги.
Okay, thank you very much.
Ну, наверное, мы на этом закончили. Я предлагаю
I think this is the end of this particular session. Let's give a hand to our panelists. Thank you so much, guys.